All right, we're good to go.
All right, everyone, welcome to the webinar. We're excited to hear about NAV Licensing 101 with Innovia's Jeff Pergolski. He is our Customer Engagement Specialist. He's been with Innovia since 2008 and NAV since 2009. And so we are going to be recording this webinar today. So if you have any questions, you can type them into the question box, and toward the end of the webinar, we will get them called out and answered for you. And also, I just wanted to let you know that all of our webinars are recorded, so you can see any of them on our website, and this one will be on the website later this afternoon. So I'm going to send it over to Jeff, and he will get us started.
All right, thank you. And thanks everyone for being here. NAV Licensing 101. So licensing is, let me just kick through my slides here. Licensing is not a very exciting topic. I am one of Innovia's licensing experts, started on the Microsoft Classic licensing and then transitioned to NAV. So as we'll see as we get through this presentation, NAV licensing oftentimes involves other technology and other licensing from Microsoft, specifically SQL, and also, I guess, some server CALs for Windows Server. So licensing is not a super exciting topic, but it's a very important topic. And so we're just going to cover this this basics. I hope that the title would indicate 101, sort of the basics of NAV licensing. We're not going to get too far in the weeds in this presentation, but I'm happy to attempt to answer any questions that get in the weeds, or most likely I would have to do some follow-up, because even as one of our licensing experts at Innovia, when it comes to getting answers, I'm oftentimes forced to go to Microsoft or an ISV to be sure that I've got the right answer. So that's most likely what will happen today. If you've got a very difficult question, hopefully we keep it at a one-on-one level, and we just get this. I've presented this every couple years, I guess, because it's, as I said, important, and licensing considerations can be expensive as it relates to ERP. Not so terribly expensive as it relates to NAV, because I think NAV is a moderately priced system, but certainly that's all relative depending on the size of your organization. So what are we going to cover today? We're going to hit an overview of the NAV licensing piece, sort of from both a functionality standpoint and a user standpoint. How do you properly license users, and how do you properly license the system based on the functionality that you need? The different licensing models, mainly Perpetual, owning it, and the subscription model, which has become more popular in the last couple of years. And then we're going to touch on the enhancement plan as it relates to NAV, because that is an important consideration when you look at total cost of ownership of the system, and specifically the licensing. That enhancement plan has to be in the equation, and then just a little bit on some other considerations. So we will jump right in. Basically, the important question: why do you care? Why does anyone care about licensing? Not that you're going to go lock you up in Microsoft jail, but it's important to get your licensing right. Microsoft, along with just about every other software vendor on the planet, has been doing more to ensure that users are licensing their software correctly. So the mechanism that Microsoft uses is an audit. I believe they've got a euphemistic name for audit that sounds a little less threatening, but we have worked through these licensing audits with several of our customers. Most of the time, it's more difficult to accomplish on the classic licensing side, because there's so many different pieces to it. The NAV licensing is fairly straightforward, but essentially That's why people care about licensing. We want to be sure that we are protected, that we're doing it right. We want to be sure of that as a partner, that we give our customers good advice, and that we're following Microsoft guidelines and end user licensing agreements and all those other stuff that no one likes to talk about. So that's why it matters. We don't want anyone going to Microsoft jail. So big picture, what we're talking about here is sort of in this nice little diagram that speaks to both the types of users that you can get in Microsoft NAV, a full user and a limited user, and then the functionality of the system, which starts with in that lower left-hand corner, the starter pack, and then adding on the extended pack for optional functionality, or as Microsoft refers to it, advanced functionality. So we are, that's, and then I guess on the, not to leave out, on the bottom of that is the configuration ability. So configuration and development gives you access to application objects. So if you want to do some coding yourself, you would buy that bottom piece. And essentially, for a piece of software that is as potentially complicated and certainly as powerful as NAV is, it's a pretty simplified system in terms of licensing. You've got two different types of users, and then the two different functionality groups, and then an application layer if you want to customize the software or do any of your own development work. So that is the basis on where we start, and where this licensing starts to become a little more complicated is when you look at the fact that there are decisions in the purchasing model. Do you want to buy the licensing, or do you want to subscribe to it? And some of those decisions, when overlaid on this simplified big picture, start to create a matrix of possibilities that then you sort of have to navigate through to make sure that you're getting exactly what your company needs, that you've got some flexible options. So as business drivers change going forward, you've got the flexibility to make adjustments to your licensing, and then also that you don't pigeonhole yourself and make a short-term decision based on maybe just cost savings or in the moment pricing that leads you to expensive mistakes down the road. So we start out pretty simple, and that's let's just jump in right there to what's included in the starter pack. Now this is sort of a the type is on here. The font is probably too small to read. Most of this content is sort of a summary of the Microsoft licensing guide, with a little bit added perspective of someone who's been in the channel for a while and has seen a lot of different licensing scenarios and licensing questions. So the functionality, as you can see here, that comes included in the starter pack, basically everything you need to run financials is in here. It's a lot of the basic customer relationship management, project management, supply chain management, and so all the parts of NAV are essentially, I shouldn't say, the majority of the parts of NAV are included in here in a basic scenario, but if you're going to go deep into any of these different areas, then you want to get into the extended pack. And as you can see, the graphic improves a little bit here. There's not as much included in this extended pack, but when you start to get to things like intercompany postings, you want the ability to do cost accounting. You want to add service items and service orders to the customer relationship management piece, or do planning and dispatching. So any of our customers that are using service management in a way to schedule their employees would certainly need the extended pack. And on the warehouse management, the basic functionality in warehouse management requires the extended pack. So all the order promising, putaways, warehouse shipments and receipts, etc. That requires the extended pack. And the functional area that really drives users to purchase the extended pack is the manufacturing side. So production orders, the supply planning, demand forecasting, setting up machine centers, etc. That requires the extended pack, and that's where we really see a lot of people make the decision to go with the extended pack, is if you're going to do any sort of manufacturing in NAV. From a configuration standpoint, there's you get a little bit more in terms of code units, tables, and pages, but for the extended pack, really, it comes down to manufacturing and maybe service. The configuration components are the two different licenses that you can add for the application builder and solution developer, as well as being able to buy pages, reports, code units, etc. as necessary. So this is going to, and in this configuration component section here, we're going to be introduced to the item that I've got highlighted here, the fine print. So this is sort of a recurring theme as it relates to licensing. Microsoft is no different than any other software company. The fine print is important, considering that we are in the Halloween season here. This guy looks pretty scared. I thought this was an appropriate graphic, because really, how many of us go through and read the fine print? It's the minority of people that go through and do that, and unfortunately, the fine print as it relates to licensing is always important. So the fine print in that, if I just go back to that slide, application builder and solution developer are not available in a subscription model. So if you are a company that is considering the move to subscription from Perpetual, or maybe you're new to NAV and looking at it and thinking, it would be better for us. It would be better for us to pay monthly rather than having a big capital expenditure and having to buy software. But we have our own development expertise on staff, and we're going to want to do development work. And then the subscription model is not for you, because the application builder and solution developer, the two tools you need in order to do your own development in the system, are not available in a subscription model. So again, not important to everyone, but terribly important to some people. So we will get here to the basics, and we're going to start with user type, full users and limited users, and essentially the only difference is the write capabilities in the system. From a read perspective, a limited user or a full user both have the same access. You can see everything in the system. You can, with appropriately assigned security permissions, you can make any changes to the system that you want, even as a limited user. You don't need to be a full user to do that. But when it comes time to writing to the system, to posting transactions, especially, that's where a limited user is terribly limited. From a dollar perspective, full user retails for $3,000, where a limited user retails for $600. So there's significant savings there going to a limited user. So then the question is, will a limited user work for me? We have a lot of companies, because the limited user is something relatively new that's only been around for the past couple years. People still have that perception that, I want to make sure that my employees are empowered to do what they need in the system. So I want to get them a full user even though they're not posting transactions, maybe they're just they're creating purchase orders, but they're not going to pay anything. They're creating invoices, but they're not going to post. I'm going to have my accounting team have the ability to post. It really comes down to the fine print as it is, and here these tables are available in the licensing guide as a separate appendix. So you can dive in, and as a follow-up, anyone that wants that, these forms are readily available in Customer Source. If you're a customer, they're available on the internet, but we're also happy to share them with you as follow-up. So you can just send an email or reply to the email you would get from this webinar, and I'm happy to send this to you. Basically, a limited user has a number of tables that they are allowed to post to that don't count against the three permitted tables. So essentially, how a limited user is limited in from a write capability in NAV is that they can write to all of these tables plus 3 that you choose, and so that's sort of flexible. Where Microsoft came up with the 3 tables, I would be interested in knowing, because essentially, if you're going to post to something in NAV, because of how linked the tables are, it is often you're posting to one table, but that table is linked to 3 other tables. You're going to start to get kicked out. So and limited users are one of the areas where I think companies don't appreciate the flexibility that Microsoft is trying to give in terms of helping them save costs, because it seems like as often as we recommend going with limited users, a lot of times companies just say, you know what, I don't want to risk it, so I'm just gonna buy a full user. And thinking about a one-time fee of the difference of $2,400 between the $600 cost of a limited user and a $3,000 full user, $2,400 is part of the equation. But then you also have to consider that you're paying 16% on that $2,400 difference for as long as you own the system. In terms of the annual enhancement. So $2,400 difference plus 16%, you're looking at about $400 a year. So it can be a fairly significant number over time, certainly with all the different effects of competition. You want to make sure that your ERP system is as lean and mean as it can be from both a cost perspective and an overall burden to the company. And so we want to get it right. And if you can take advantage of limited users, why not do it? So again, here are the details, the fine print. Read access to any data in NAV, write access to a maximum of 3 tables with the following exceptions. And you will see that there is limited users. Limited users can't post general ledger entries and access control, etc. So there are some major areas in the system that limited users can't go to, but that is. But especially if you are familiar and you've been running NAV for a while and you need to add users to the system, that's maybe when it's a good time to start thinking about, do all the users do the new users that I'm going to add need the full functionality of a full user license? Or if maybe they do, then it's also important to consider your existing user base. And if you have people that are on the shop floor and maybe you want, because of approvals, etc., you want them to be able to enter data in the system, so they absolutely need a license to do that. but they're not going to be posting anything. They're just going to be entering some data, and then someone else is going to approve the information that they're entering in the system and then post that. Maybe some of those users could get away with limited user licenses. We've had a lot of success with our customer base, helping them find areas like that to save money and to analyze what your users are doing in the system, and see as as you're adding licensing to the system, if you can get away with a less expensive user. And so, but again, it's important to read the fine print. This is something, I guess, that we're always on the lookout for, but it's the sort of like the showstoppers, the deal breakers as it relates to limited users, and how does that are there ways to get around the system? So we've got some savvy NAV users that would ask questions like, is there a way that maybe we can create and I'm not going to say that any of our customers, past or present, have ever done this, but what if we want to create a single user that all of our 60-person sales team would use some sort of automated process to collect orders in an Excel spreadsheet, maybe submit it to a website that then grabs those orders and converts them, pushes them into NAV and posts them, etc. Rather than buying 60 users, we'll just buy one and add it to a temporary table, and then have another either automated process, push it into NAV, or have a user back at the home office that does it on a regular basis, push all that data in. Is that legal? And unfortunately, it's not, based on licensing agreement with Microsoft. And so I'm calling that out here on a separate slide because we have potentially run into this before, where you're trying to get around the licensing restrictions by being creative with it, and just to know what Microsoft is telling you explicitly in there. I mean, there are certainly gray areas that we run into as it relates to licensing, and that we take on a case-by-case basis to Microsoft to ask them, hey, if this is what we're doing, how do we properly license this? Or occasionally, this is what a customer is doing. Is this properly licensed, or do they need full users, etc. We understand that from a licensing perspective, having to license, essentially in a situation where you've got 60 salespeople, adding 60 NAV licenses is really expensive. But again, those in this scenario, you could have the sales users could be limited users entering that data, and 60 users at $300 a piece is a lot of money. But at least you're legal, and so that's that would be a potential workaround for that. It's just trying to get around the licensing issue by using something like temporary tables, and then having a full user push that into the system and post it is getting around what Microsoft says is allowed. So in that scenario, not a great use for a limited user, but who does make a good limited user, and oftentimes, surprisingly, I think to some of our customers, the C-level people actually make a great limited user, CEO especially. And that really comes down to, people that aren't posting transactions in the system, but still want access to all the data. And absolutely, a CEO in most scenarios is one of those people. And I understand occasionally CEOs roll their sleeves up and get in and are posting transactions, whether they be payments or vendor stuff. But in general, the C-level people just need access to all the data in the system. They're not necessarily the ones that are posting. So that is something to consider. All right. So what's another scary area as it relates to licensing? External users. So that is Another question that we get a lot of times. What about external users? Whether those external users are accountants that are helping helping you report tax compliance, etc. What maybe they are vendors that tier one critical vendors for your company that you want to give access to the system. Maybe they're customers that you want to allow them to take a peek in at status of complicated production, for something that you're making for them. How do you properly license them? And so basically, Microsoft has I think a pretty fair way to handle this. So customers don't require an access license, and they can still get in and look at a bunch of stuff in NAV. And the fine print as it relates to external users is right here. So your customers are external users, and starter pack, you don't need even the extended pack, just the basic starter pack gives you the right for unlimited number of external users to access. And the two restrictions that are in the fine print are these users can't use any client to interface the system. So that you can't give them a NAV login with the and let them use the even just the web client or from the tablet client. When they're accessing data, you've got to provide that to them in a manner that doesn't require a client. So you're doing some web interface, etc. And then the other point that external user licenses cannot be used to provide business process outsourcing. So you can't get it to be used as an outsourced service. That violates the end user licensing agreement as it relates to NAV. So, but if again you want people to be able to see status of orders, status of accounts, etc., you put together a web API that goes in and grabs that information and provides it back to them in the form of a PDF, or allows them to request copies of invoices or statements, etc. You can do that as long as you're not giving users access using one of the clients, one of the Microsoft clients, to access that data. And that's always a question that comes up: external users to the system, because in terms of just ERP in general, and certainly Microsoft specifically, the application, the NAV application, is continuing to become more flexible and reach into more systems, both reaching out into different systems like Power BI and any of the reporting tools using Microsoft Flow, and then at the same time allowing access from the outside in. So bidirectional access is becoming more and more important. And so how do you properly license that access so you're sure you're not violating any of the rules? And so as it relates to licensing, some of these terms that jump out, multiplexing is another scary term. So we started talking about external users. Now multiplexing is a term that, if you're not in the licensing world, maybe doesn't make sense to you. But what is multiplexing? So multiplexing is the use of hardware or software to reduce the number of users that directly access NAV. And essentially what you're doing is pooling connections and trying to essentially fool the system by using one full user to or maybe more than one in a pool to allow access to multiple people. Now, unfortunately, that does not reduce the number of access licenses required. So any user that directly or indirectly reads from or writes to NAV's database in real time or via a batch, so you can't stack them up and just have a a batch process, grab a bunch of stuff that people entered in, and as I mentioned in that sales scenario before, everyone's got to be licensed that are accessing the system and posting in that manner. So the only exception, or not even an exception, but just a clarification on Microsoft's part, is that licensed users may manually rekey information coming from non-licensed users. So, someone emailing an order in, and then having someone enter that in, clearly that user's not using, doesn't have access to the system, the one that's sending the email in. But this multiplexing is a lot of times the way that people try to get around with, taking advantage of the job queues and batch processing, et cetera, and having, a single user account that different users can log in. And as we dive into the sort of the differences between the buying models, so we'll hit on a couple other considerations, but essentially multiplexing and external users are the big I would say areas where potentially people are violating the end user licensing agreement. So we just want to make sure that if you're considering a solution, where you've got multiple users, we want to make sure that whatever you're thinking of does not meet Microsoft's definition of multiplexing, and then try to figure out the most efficient way, the most cost-effective way to license those users. If you want to customize NAV yourself, as I said before, the application is, there's fairly almost complete access to, there are a few tables and areas of NAV that you can't customize, even with both the application development and or the application builder and solution developer granules, but you can get access to just about everything. And as it relates to what you need to do in the system, certainly you'd want to work with your partner to verify, do I need access to this? Do I need to buy these granules? Or if I own these, will I be able to do X, Y, and Z, whatever it is that's on your list? For us, myself personally, I'm looking that up on probably not a weekly basis, but a quarterly basis, that I've got someone that's contacted me and said, this is what we're thinking about doing, and we've got some smart people on our team that we think we can do this ourselves without Innovia's help. But do we need to buy these granules or not? And I think that quite often the application is becoming, especially NAV 2017, there's a lot more configuration changes that you can make. There's, being able to create some reports using the Word templates, and dumping everything to Excel, all these things that allow you to push your NAV data around and make the application more flexible, I think makes the need for the customization piece less important. But again, if you're considering it because those pieces are expensive, in the neighborhood of $35,000, I think, for both pieces, you're going to want to make sure that buying those will give you access to everything that you need, because it is in the fine print that it's not quite everything. So in terms of now the licensing models, so we talked about from a functionality standpoint the differences between the extended pack and the starter pack, and a little bit we spent a little more time looking at comparing the limited users to full users, and now we look at the licensing model of buying versus leasing. So essentially, it's a lot like when you're looking at, in most people's experience, I guess, buying or leasing a vehicle or buying or leasing a home. That upfront cost compared to that monthly recurring cost. As it relates to NAV, you see the check marks here on this box. If you're doing, self-managed on-premise deployment, you are going to want to buy the licensing in what Microsoft refers to as the perpetual licensing model. Self-managed hosted, you need to own it. You can't subscribe to it. If you're going to subscribe to it, you're going to be on a partner-managed on-premise deployment or a partner-managed hosted deployment. And essentially, you will see that there is there's another asterisk here. So if you want to do self-managed hosted, so you're going to host it not with your partner, not with Microsoft, you're going to host it anywhere else, it's required that you have an active enhancement plan. That's something that not a lot of people know, although it's called out clearly in the licensing guide. It is included just in the fine print, so maybe that's why people don't get it. But that's an important consideration, that if you're going to host it somewhere, that you be current on maintenance. And there's certainly a lot of other reasons to be current on maintenance that we're going to dive into just briefly in a second. But that's basically the difference in terms of what it takes to run NAV on premise. You can do it in a subscription model if your partner is going to manage that instance to allow you to subscribe to it. And of course, you don't own your own license if you are subscribing to it. The other big difference is that in Perpetual, you've got the flexibility of a concurrent access license compared to subscription, where it is just a per user access license. So in a Perpetual world, you could buy 10 licenses and you could have 20 NAV users, but maybe those 20 NAV users are in 2 different shifts of 10 people. You could actually just buy 10 and have 20 people have access to the system at various times, but only 10 of them concurrently. In a subscription world, you can't do that. In a subscription world, you've got a per user access. So even though you could have that same scenario where you had 20 users and only 10 of them logging in at a time, in a per user world, the user accounts that you'd create for your different people would have to be identical. So you'd only create 10 accounts and 20 people would log in with those 10, but there would be no differentiation and you couldn't customize the role centers. They would actually have to share an account essentially. So, which again is pushing the limits to the end user licensing agreement as it relates to subscription. So that is something to consider as well when looking at licensing. If you're making a decision between owning and leasing or perpetual and subscription, does concurrent access licenses, is the way that your business is set up, does that preclude you from using a subscription service? So again, you can the starter pack in the Perpetual world. Starter pack gets you 3 full concurrent CALs included with it, and then you can add the extended pack on to that. An important consideration that we started to talk to as we differentiated between subscription and Perpetual is how are users counted in the system. That can sometimes be difficult. So as it states here again in the fine print, NAV has 2 concurrency counters, one for full users and one for limited. If you don't have any limited users, obviously you don't care about that counter, but essentially what it's doing is just keeping track. Now, the important thing, I guess, that I wanted to call out in this slide is that is how the user count is released, how long a session is held on to, because over the years there's been some bumps in the road that Microsoft has experienced in that way. And so they've actually made some improvements here, but when a full user accesses a session using web services, that session is locked for a minimum of 2 hours. So what that means is, if you're using a web client, if you're not using a web client, then you shouldn't give your users the rights to do that. If you are in a situation where you've got more users than you have access licenses, because what happens is if someone logs in using the web service, it will and then checks something and signs right back out, that license is held onto in the system counter for 2 hours. And so 2 hours can be an eternity if you've got people waiting to access the system. So what application you're using, or what client, I should say, that you're using to access the system doesn't affect the count, but it does affect how long the session's being held. So for limited users, that's almost an advantage of limited users. The session is held on to for a minimum of 15 minutes. And the user may release the lock session at any time by logging in with a NAV client and logging out. So there are some workarounds to get that limitation of the 2 hours for a web service session being held on to. You can always log in, log back out, but those are the devil is in the details, and it's important to know that as you're looking at the situation and evaluating which of these is going to work better for you. And again, last part of that slide, that what users accessing the application indirectly through third-party app, they do require to be licensed and using the appropriate CAL type. And Microsoft is sort of the responsibility for ensuring concurrency usage falls on the third-party application provider. So they're trying to say, if you figure out a way to outsmart us and we catch you, ultimately, we're going to put that back on you, as it's your responsibility to make sure that your system is licensed or is accessing our system correctly. And we'll find that, like a lot of times in the warehousing area, you've got device clients that the warehouse users are using to fill in information on a pick ticket or something. And if we're working with InsightWorks or Lanham, they've got the licensing. They know they've worked out with Microsoft what the proper way to license that is, and most of the time they will include that in their software so that we know that that we're licensing it correctly, and whatever is on the gun, whatever software needs to run on the gun, there'll be questions like, are you going to allow these warehouse users to post, because sometimes that's most efficient. You trust your people on the floor, you empower them with the right tools, and then they can post right away. Well, then they need potentially a more expensive access license to the system. So that's important. As it relates then the types of in subscription licensing model, there's a standard user, extended use, additive, and then a limited user. So you can still get a limited user in the subscription licensing model, but as we see on this next slide, and actually I guess in terms of what the extended use additive subscription access license is it sort of gives you all the access that the extended pack does in the perpetual world, and you just add that on to the standard user sale, and when that's priced out, that's the way it is. It's priced out. As you see here, there is a difference between, or there's a limitation in that you can't have a standard user accessing the extended pack. That should be a no-brainer, but we've had people ask, and Microsoft must have as well, because they've got a reference it in one of their graphics here. Something to consider when doing user count is that NAV does include one subscription access license for an external accounting user, kind of in the purpose of maybe you don't have a bookkeeper on staff, and so you're going to give access to that. And then also you get one subscription user account for a system administrator. So you don't have to say, okay, well, I need IT to be I need IT to have access to the system, so I'm gonna have to buy a user for them. That's actually included. So you get essentially two users, one for external bookkeeper and one for system admin, that you don't need to purchase. But again, those users can't be in the system posting anything, or they're provided for a specific purpose and shouldn't be used for getting around or trying to reduce the number of users that you want to pay for. And finally, the subscription licensing term. There's actually some good news here, but obviously, subscription licensing model has a lot of flexibility to it. So you can have prorated for adding users, and the only commitment is for a full month term. So once you add a user, your NAV employee count changes. You can reduce that without any penalty. All you're obligated to is 1 month per user that you add. So that's a nice bit of flexibility that you gain using the subscription licensing model. So that's something to consider. Does your workforce vary? Is it seasonal work that you do? Then maybe you'd want to provide the subscription licensing model, because it gives you that flexibility. Okay, now another scary area as it relates to licensing is the enhancement plan. That is a recurring 16%, at least as it relates to Microsoft. Some of the ISVs have differing percentages up to, I think, 20%. But it's definitely an important piece of the overall total cost of ownership. So what does that? What are the benefits of having an enhancement plan? License mobility rights. Again, we talked about. You've got your NAV on premise, and you're going to move it to the cloud somewhere on your own. You're not going to involve your partner or Microsoft in this move. You're just going to move it to some hosting provider. By rights, you can only do that if you have the license mobility rights that are included in your enhancement plan. So that's something that's important. And the optimizing ongoing value, of course, that relates to or is on there because you get the new version rights. So that's really a big part of why you'd want to be on the enhancement plan, to always have access to the latest and greatest version of NAV. As Microsoft has fine-tuned the application to make upgrades less complicated and thus less expensive, it makes it more appealing to end users to always be on the latest and greatest version. So certainly you'd want your enhancement plan in place to do that. Excuse me, the protecting your investment and offering flexibility, etc. Those are just some of the language that Microsoft likes to use as it relates to your ERP system is arguably the most important piece of software in your organization. So you're going to want to keep taking advantage of all the technological advances that the latest version provides you with. So the other important considerations as it relates to enhancement plans around NAV is as an idea called protective list price. So your annual enhancement is based on 16% of the value of your software when you purchased it. So if you let that lapse and then have to and then determine that you're, maybe you let it lapse because you're in a really tough financial spot and you say, I just can't afford it this year. What are the long-term ramifications of that? So first of all, you lose your protected list price. So if you bought NAV 10 years ago and the value of your software was $50,000, over 10 years now, what would it cost to buy that same number of users and the same functionality? Maybe that $50,000 now goes up to $70,000, and that's the new price. So you've lost the protected list price. So now you're paying 16%, even though you haven't added any software or any functionality. Your NAV maintenance bill went from the 16% of $50,000, which is if my degree in math serves me correctly, $8,000. Now you go to 16% of $70,000. So essentially you're paying 16% more on $20,000 because you lost your protected list price. And you're paying that for each and every year that you go forward with NAV. And then there's also the 19% lapsed penalty. So now what at the time would have cost you the $8,000 to renew, now you're looking at the additional $20,000, so the additional $3,200 on that, plus you're paying a 19% lapse penalty to get you back to being current, and then that penalty is just a one-time fee, but it does get more expensive every year. And as it relates to, we've helped our customers find more creative ways. A lot of times it's people know, like, okay, you know what, we're moving off of NAV, and so we don't need this maintenance plan for next year, because by this time next year we're going to be on a new version of a completely different piece of software. We're not going to use NAV, and that's fine. That happens. That's a way of life in the world of business. Systems change. The important thing to remember is that if you need to access the system, we've had occasions where to migrate data, customer needs to buy some extra tables in NAV, and they don't discover that till they're 3 months into their project of migrating to the new system. They've let their NAV expire, and now they need to buy new tables, but they can't, because you can only buy if your maintenance is current. And so to add those tables, we have to go through the 19% penalty, and then they have to pay a year. They have to pay their maintenance again, so they're paying losing their protected list price plus the 19%, and they need to buy $800 worth of tables, and it ends up being $50,000, where it could have been just renewing their NAV maintenance for $30,000 and getting the $800 on top of it and being done with it. So important to understand when the life cycle of licensing as it relates to NAV ends, is really, you should be sure that you're comfortable in the new system before you decide to let that NAV maintenance expire. And in terms of safer ways to save money than letting it lapse, we've sometimes suggested, hey, how about you reduce the user count, and sometimes even reduce it down to just 1 or 2 users plus the base functionality. That dramatically reduces your annual enhancement for that last year, but still gives you access to, if you need to buy some extra tables, etc. It gives you access to do that without the penalties, etc. And and actually every time you're looking at most people in most case scenarios, your NAV user count doesn't dramatically differ. But in some organizations, if you've downsized over the years, if parts of your business have been sold off and or even turned into their own business entities with their own software, if you're looking at 50 users that you're renewing in your annual enhancement every year, but you've now only have 20 users using the software, it's important enough. It certainly makes sense to discuss with your partner whether reducing the number of users on your annual enhancement makes sense. Sometimes that can save you several $1,000s. Now, of course, if you drop those users when you need to add them back, you're going to have to pay full price and $3,000 a user, and it's going to go back 16% of that, but there's no penalty to add users as long as you maintain your coverage. So that's another way to maybe look at getting more bang for your buck, is through reducing your user count to be accurately reflecting the number of users you have in your system. And then, we've got some spreadsheets put together in terms of helping you just see what that, sort of how you roll the dice and where those numbers work out. Last but not least, additional software. So as it relates to NAV, SQL and server cals, it's important that you, especially if you're doing this on premise, that you have the right software to run NAV, and you have enough SQL and you have enough Windows Server cals for all of your NAV users to access the system. And again, your partner should be able to help you do that. But that's something when you start to look at like Microsoft hosting on Azure. When you look at those subscription models, they have all the licensing you need calculated into that one monthly fee. When you start to look at doing that on premise, then you have to start adding up okay, well, we need a server for the service tier, and we need one for the SQL server, and we need operating system licenses for those machines, and we need client access licenses for those machines above and beyond what we need for NAB. So just wanted to put a note on there. Don't forget about that. And I think then this is my last fine print. No, I'm just kidding. That's the end of what I've got here. It looks like we've only got 4 or 5 minutes left in our 1 hour of time, but I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I don't know, I tried to kind of reference the questions that I have encountered over the last 8 or 9 years of working with Microsoft licensing as it relates to this. But Angie, are there any questions that came in over the chat window?
No questions, Jeff.
Okay. If there are no questions, I'm done presenting. Anything you want to say, Angie?
Yes. Thank you, everyone, for attending this webinar, and thank you, Jeff, for presenting it. Very informative information. And just to remind everyone, it is recorded, so later this afternoon this will be available on our website for you to view again or share with anyone else, www.innovia.com. And you can also click on our past events page and select this webinar or a different one. And I'd just like to thank everyone again, and remember to come back and attend our November 2nd webinar. It will be with Dynamic Manufacturing, End-to-End NAV Solutions. So hope to see everyone then, and have a great rest of your week and weekend, and we'll go from there. Have a good day.
All right. Thanks, Angie.
Thank you.
Bye.